Alright, welcome back to Learning with Merit. Today we're going to talk about Python comments, data types, print functions, and variables. This is meant to be a beginner level lesson on things we need to know just to get started in Python. And of course there will be videos later that cover more and more topics in Python. The first thing we always need to know is how do we actually make a note or a comment in the programming language we're using. In Python you use a hashtag symbol to make a single line comment. And this is something that will be ignored by Python's interpreter, or the thing that reads the code. And this allows us to make notes and things like that for other programmers or for ourselves to read later, but does not affect our code. We also have multi-line comments. Sometimes we need to make multiple lines of comments in order for them to be understood or for notes for you to read later. So we use 3 single quotes to make a multiple line comment, and you're going to see me using these quite a bit throughout the videos that I use, just to add notes and things like that that you can read, so you're not having to just listen to me as we go along. Add a few lines here. Things we are going to cover in this video. First of all, we are going to cover single and multi-line comments. We already have done that, but I wanted to do that before I threw this at you. We're going to talk about data types. There are more data types in this, but we're going to talk about the 5 most common ones you're going to see. We're going to talk about sequence in programming and sequential programming. We're going to talk about Python, the print function, which we are going to need to understand how to use before we really understand functions. And then we are going to talk about literals, which are actual values, versus variables or containers that store values. And then aliases will be the final thing we do before we wrap this up. Firstly, let's talk about syntax and what that word means. You're going to hear me say it several times. Python syntax. Syntax are the rules for the writing of a language, right? So the syntax we are given are things like hashtags or single quotes or triple single quotes. These are things that are common to Python. They are how you write the language so that it can be correctly interpreted by others and by the interpreter, which is how Python reads its code and then outputs text or outputs whatever it needs to output. Data types are the first things we need to deal with. We're going to be dealing with data all the time. And we're going to start with something called literals. Literals are actual values. So they don't represent something else. They don't store something else. They are actually what they are shown to be. Here we are going to start with 4 actual or literal values. Whoops, accidentally clicked the wrong key there. And I will paste these in as soon as I get them copied correctly. So here we have something in quotes. This appears to be some text in quotes, and we call this a string. And strings are in quotes. Okay, and you can use single or double quotes. I use double quotes because in other languages there is actually a difference, and I think it's a better habit to use double quotes. But you will see a lot of people in Python use single quotes, much like this, to indicate a string. Now we also have integers, which are whole number data types, like the number 5. You won't see any parts or fractions on this, and that's why it is a whole number or an integer. Then we have floating point numbers. So floats are called floats because of the decimal, which we would call a floating point, but you can think of them as decimal numbers if that helps you. So 3.14 would be a float data type. And then one maybe you haven't dealt with so much, but have certainly heard about, is a Boolean. And a Boolean is a true or a false value. All of these are literals. Hello world is a string literal, 5 is an integer literal, 3.14 is a float literal, and true is a Boolean literal. They are the actual values. The last one we need to talk about that we are going to see stores multiple values, and we call it a list. So here, to write a list, the syntax for it is we use a square bracket. We provide an element or an item, then we add a comma, we add a new element, comma, new element, and then we close the list off with a final square bracket. So lists are going to contain multiple items called elements, so each thing in the list is called an element, and then the way we are going to access those later is indexes. The index starts at 0 and goes up by 1 each time. So here A would have the index of 0, B the index of 1, and C the index of 2. And we will use these later whenever we talk more about lists and even strings to understand how to access each element. Interestingly enough, later we'll learn that strings are actually just lists, basically, of characters. So H would be 0, E would be 1, L would be 2, L would be 3, so on and so forth. So these are our 5 data types. We have a string, an integer, a float, a boolean, and a list. And these are the ones we are going to deal with most often in Python, especially as a beginner. And later on you will learn about other data types as they come. So just a quick disclaimer there. There are more data types, but these are the main types for beginners. It is important for us to understand sequence. Programs are in sequence, and we execute code from top to bottom and left to right. So we always want to make sure that we do things in the correct order, and sometimes, if you're not careful, you may end up accidentally doing them in the wrong order, and that cause an issue. So that is sequence. Top to bottom, left to right. The print function. The print function is fairly simple. You write print, and then open and close parentheses. The print function is not like printing a piece of paper, but it is to print something to the screen. So the print function, we use the name print and then open and close parentheses every time, and then we stick what we want to have printed inside of those parentheses. So let's try it with the variables we have used so far. Write those on here. Here we have top to bottom sequence. It should print this one, then this one, whoops, then this one, 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 right? In order from top to bottom, going from 45 to 50 line-wise. Now you won't see anything in 45 because I didn't tell it to print anything. We copy this, stick it in our Python test file, save and hit run. We see a blank line, hello world, 5, 3.14, true and false. And that's what we wanted it to print out. So that illustrates our top to bottom sequence and how to use the print function. Now we might see one left to right. You may be like, why is it left to right? Well, sometimes if you use a semicolon, you can put multiple little functions or multiple variables or multiple something on the same line and use the semicolon to separate those. So now it's left to right. We have this print function first, then we have this print function. So we should see a blank line and then hello world this time. And we do. There's a blank line and hello world in sequence. Should probably grab this, stick it over here. Now more on the print line or print function. After printing, the cursor goes to a new line, and that is built into the print function. So if we actually want to change that, we use a comma and then the end equals to change what the end is. So we want to keep that cursor on the same line. So there is a difference between these two, and let's look at them in the test file. So here we have print hello world. This will print hello and world on separate lines. But this one down here should print them on the same line. So let's see what we get. Make sure I clear everything out. Hit run again. There we go. All right, so hello and world on two different lines. That's this one right here. But then we've got hello world on the same line. And that is because I used this little end piece to indicate I just wanted to add a space at the end instead of a new line character. Now keep in mind, this doesn't work on earlier versions of Python. You have to at least have Python version 3, which most people do at this point, but you at least have to have Python version 3 for this to work. Otherwise, you may get an error. Let's talk about variables now. We've been using literals all the way so far. A string literal, that's a string literal, that's a string literal. Float literal, Boolean not Boolean, integer literal, Boolean literal. These are all literal values, but sometimes that's not going to work for us. We don't need literal values. We need something that can vary and store a value that changes maybe. And so we need to bring in variables. Now, variables are just containers that store data values. And in order to assign a value, a literal value to a variable, we use a single equal sign. So here's a short example. Here we have our variable called container, and then we have a literal value that's been assigned to it with the equal sign. So container equals hello world. So if I was to print container, type print container like this, copy that, here's our test file, it prints hello world, just like that. Because container stores this value, and whenever I say print container, it prints the value that it stores. So let's look at some other examples. Here are all the different data types assigned to variables. So A equals a string literal, B equals the 5 integer literal, C a float literal, D a Boolean literal, and E a list literal. We can also assign variables on the same line if we wanted to. So here's an example of that. It's an F, G, and H. So because I separate these with a semicolon, I'm able to assign them all on the same line. And sometimes this is really helpful whenever I want to save space in my program and I know I'm just going to assign a few variables real quickly, and then I don't want to have a new line for each one of them. If I want to change a variable's value, I just reassign it. And this will be very useful later because that's the whole point of a variable. You are allowed to change its value. So when we start talking about loops and things like that, or switches, we might look at changing the value of a variable each time. So what should it print out? Well, if you follow the sequence, A started out at 0, then it was 1, then it was 2. And since I asked it to print A after this point, it should print the number 2. Copy, paste, save, run the number 2. Very simple. So reassigning that value can be very useful as we go through, and that's the point of variables, is we can give them different values, and that allows them to vary. There are actually a few rules for variable naming that we are going to go over. First of all, they are case sensitive. So A and capital A are not the same thing. You must start with a letter or an underscore. You can use an underscore. You cannot start with a number. You can only use A through Z lowercase, A through Z uppercase, 0 through 9, and underscore characters. And they cannot contain any spaces. Spaces are also considered a character whenever you're dealing with computers. So let's look at some legal variable names. Here are a few examples of legal variable names. Var all lowercase is legal. An underscore var, also legal. Underscores in different spots, also good. An uppercase in amongst lowercase, also good. All uppercase, that's also good. So you will also notice this is highlighted a little differently. That's because lots of times we will use all uppercase for special cases. And then here we have added a number, but you'll notice that number is not at the beginning. So these are all legal variable names, all different ways that you can name them. And usually we want to name them after what they store, what that number is supposed to represent. Here are a few illegal variable names. So adding a 1 at the beginning, that makes this illegal and even turns red. We cannot use other special characters like a dash. Can't use exclamation points, stars, anything like that. This is also illegal. And we cannot use one that has a space in it. That is also illegal. That will not work. All of these will cause you errors. All of these will not. Finally, let's talk about something called aliases. Aliases are just different names for the same thing. We can use this to our advantage in programming. So if I create a variable called a, and I assign it the string, some text, I can assign one variable to store another. So here we could say b equals a. Oops, a. And you might think, well, what would b equal? Well, b should equal some text since it's the same as a. Then I could say c equals b. Well, if c equals b and b equals a, and a equals some text, then c should equal some text. Then if I type print c, I should get some text out. So let's go check this in our test file. And I get some text out. Let's see something even crazier. If I say c now equals other text, let's see what happens. So I type print c. What if I type print a? So now we see that they're different. Because I was able to reassign. What if I did print b? Well, it should also be some text, just like that. What if I reassigned a? So a equals other. And then I asked it to print c. So this is interesting. C still says some text instead of other. But that's because I reassigned a here, but c was assigned up here. What if maybe I did this? A equals other right here in the sequence. Let's see what c prints out now. It still prints out some text, but that's because c is a reference to b, which is a reference to a at this point in the program, where it is some text. It is not a reference to a at this point in the program. So, aliases. They're just different names for the same thing. So, C is an alias for B, which is an alias for A. That should get us started in Python and have everything we need to move on and learn more at this point. We were able to learn how to use single and multi-line comments. We were able to use the 5 most common data types and identify them. We now know sequence, which is top to bottom, left to right. We know how to use the print function. We know about literals, which are actual values. We know about variables, which are containers to store values. And then we know about aliases, which reference the same data. Thank you for watching.